What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face,
hey, how you doing?
My name is Jessica, and every week I sit down here and I talk about a true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. It's a pretty good time if I do say so myself. So if you'd be interested in joining me back here from now on, then go ahead and subscribe to the channel and like this video. Those things mean so much to me and they really do help out the channel a lot. So thank you in advance for doing so. That is, if you chose to do so. If not, that is totally fine. Obviously, true crime and makeup isn't everyone's cup of tea. So if you would rather hear today's story presented in a more traditional format, feel free to check out the description box where, because I'm a nice person, I've taken the time to list some other creators that have covered today's story without looking like a river troll in their intro. And with all of that said and done, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Okay, so as alluded to by the content warning, today's video, it's a rough one. Not only is it a story of kids hurting other kids, but there is just a lot of horrible and traumatic things that happen to a lot of the key players in this story. So just be aware of that going in. It's gonna be a lot. I had definitely heard this one before, but when I started researching it, I did realize that I didn't know it as well as I thought I did. I thought I had a pretty decent overview in my head of this case, but when I was looking into it, I feel like I learned a lot, especially when it came to some of the finer details. So really quickly, I do want to say thank you so much to Jen for requesting this one. I think it's an important case, and I, for one, am glad that I took the time to research it thanks to your request. All right, so just like last week, there are a lot of key players in this story, but I am going to be starting with, undeniably, the most important one. Shanda Renee Scherer was born on June 6th, 1979 in Pineville, Kentucky, to her parents Stephen and Jackie. Shanda was Jackie and Stephen's first child together. However, she was Jackie's second daughter. Jackie had been married once before Stephen to her high school sweetheart, Mike Boardman, and together, the two of them had had their own daughter, whom they named Paige. Jackie and Mike would end up getting divorced shortly after Paige was born, leaving the door open for new love when she reconnected with Stephen Scherer. Steve had attended the same high school as Jackie and Mike back in Tennessee, and he had actually been best friends with Mike in high school. And funnily enough, they had both wanted to date Jackie when she started going to their school. So in order to not let this common interest tear them apart, Steve and Mike actually flipped a coin in order to decide which of them got to ask Jackie out. And this was a 50-50 gamble that, at the time, Mike came out victorious from. Jackie and Mike then obviously went on to date, which led to Jackie finding out that she was pregnant at just 16 years old. And while this was undoubtedly scary and overwhelming, the two of them did try to make things work. They did everything that they probably felt like they were supposed to do at the time, but in the end, things just didn't work out. And so at 19 years old, Jackie found herself a single mother, barely out of high school, and working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. And I've been there, and I'm here to tell you that some days it can feel impossible. And I'd have to imagine that this wasn't exactly the easiest time in Jackie's life either. So it must have been a welcomed surprise when she and Steve reconnected one weekend when he came back into town for a visit. At the time, he had moved away and started his own business, but it was almost like fate brought them back together. They officially reunited at a local nightclub, and from there they went from old high school friends to boo things. They got married, they settled down together in Middlesboro, Kentucky, and for a while things were going really, really well for the Scherers. However, shortly after Shanda was born, Jackie and Steve packed up the girls and moved to Indiana, which is where Jackie's originally from, and for whatever reason, basically as soon as their bags hit the Indiana soil, things kind of started to fall apart, and eventually Jackie and the girls moved out and she and Steve divorced. To clarify, when I say things fell apart, I just mean the romantic aspect of their relationship. Their divorce was actually very civil, and they continued to remain friends even after it was finalized. There was never any sort of ill will between the two of them, and because their split was so amicable, they were able to co-parent Paige and Shanda really smoothly. And for the next few years, Jackie once again found herself a single mother, a title that she held until the mid-'80s when she met and married her third husband, Ronnie Ott. Ronnie was about 10-ish years older than Jackie, which led her to believe that he could provide the stability and the security that she had always been looking for. Unfortunately, though, this marriage also had an expiration date, and after about 4 years, Jackie and Ronnie got divorced. By this time, Jackie was in her mid-30s, Paige was 19 and living in her own place, and Shanda was 11. She and Jackie were actually living in New Albany, Indiana, in a townhouse right across the street from Paige. And then on the weekends, she was still regularly seeing her father at he and his wife's house in Jeffersonville. So all things considered, Shanda was an incredibly well-adjusted young girl. There is no denying that she experienced a lot of change throughout her life, but no matter the circumstances, she seemed to take it all in stride. Shanda was a sweet, happy, determined young lady. She had a ton of interests and she was involved in almost every extracurricular activity you could possibly think of. She was a cheerleader. She played volleyball. She played basketball. She played softball. She did gymnastics. She was a Girl Scout. And on top of all of this, she still managed to find time to be a regular preteen girl. She was always writing in her diary or talking on the phone with her friends, just giggling about all the boys she thought were cute. She was doing basically everything I would imagine that most of us were doing at like 11 and 12 years old. Shanda had a really good group of close friends at school. And then even outside of that specific group, she was still really popular and really well liked by the majority of her peers. So it was more than understandable that she was nervous when she found out that she would soon be leaving all of her friends and her well-established private school routine, and that in exchange, she was going to be thrust into the unknowns of public school. You see, when Jackie had been married to Ronnie, it was really no big deal for her to shell out the private school tuition every year. But following she and Ronnie's divorce, she just couldn't comfortably pull together said tuition. And that meant that Shanda would instead need to start attending nearby Hazelwood Junior High. And like I said, Shanda was really, really nervous about this, as I assume any child would be. She was scared that she wouldn't be accepted by her peers and that she wouldn't be able to make any new friends. Jackie tried to convince her that everything would be okay because, after all, Shanda had never really struggled or had any issues making friends up to this point. But even so, Shanda wrote of her fears in her diary, writing about how badly she wished that she was 13 instead of 12 because she thought if she could go to school and tell everyone that she was 13, that they would all view her as so much more of a grown-up, and that I guess they would all take her more seriously, which in turn would make it easier for her to make new friends. And I just think that is so cute, and it's like such innocent thinking. But alas, Shanda was only 12 years old, and she had close to an entire year to go before she would officially take on the role of a teenager. Shanda grappled with these fears right up until the night before she was due to start 7th grade at Hazelwood. And even though Jackie too had her own reservations about dropping Shanda into a much bigger and much less structured environment, she once again assured her that everything was going to be fine before she sent her off to bed. And you know what? At first, it seemed like Jackie's words to Shanda had held up. Shanda had an amazing first day at Hazelwood. Her teachers seemed great, the other students seemed great, and for the first time ever, she had been able to choose whatever clothes she wanted to wear to school rather than a designated uniform. It was starting to seem like public school might not be so bad. Or would it? Yeah, sadly, Shanda only got to ride this new school high for all of about 2.5 days. Because on her 3rd day of school, probably just as she and Jackie's nerves were starting to subside, Shanda unexpectedly got into a fight with another girl. So basically what had happened was Shanda had taken it upon herself to help one of her new classmates break up with her boyfriend. After class, Shanda had gone right up to this boy with zero hesitation and told him that more or less he did not have a girlfriend anymore. Not surprisingly, this boy was not very open to hearing what Shanda had to say. One, because preteen boys are kind of sort of little jerks anyways. And 2, as far as he was concerned, if his girlfriend wanted to end their relationship, she needed to come to him and do it herself. And this kind of led to a very minor kerfuffle between Shanda and this boy. A kerfuffle that, although not started by, would certainly be ended by another student named Amanda Heverin. Amanda was 14 years old, so she was 2 years older than Shanda at this time, and she was not happy to be walking down the halls only to come upon this new girl seemingly giving her cousin a hard time. Yes, Shanda's friend's boyfriend turned out to be Amanda's cousin, and Shanda was immediately intimidated by Amanda. But before she could even try to explain what was going on, Amanda pushed her down and started hitting her. And poor Shanda did not really stand much of a chance. Amanda was much bigger than she was, and by the time a teacher finally broke the girls apart, Shanda had sustained a cut on her face as well as a sizable knot on the back of her head. Jackie was completely shocked when the school called to inform her of what had happened. Shanda was always more of the girl who might get in trouble for being too friendly and not being able to stop talking during class. She was most certainly not the type of girl to get handed down a week of in-school detention for getting into a physical altercation. But regardless of whether or not Jackie could believe it, it most certainly was happening. Sidebar, did you guys have a program like that at your school? Like a during the day sort of isolated disciplinary detention style program? We did. It was called BIC at my school, which, to be honest, I really don't know even to this day what that's supposed to stand for. Okay, so it stands for Behavior Intervention Class. BIC is meant to serve as an intermediary for students experiencing discipline problems in the classroom, hallways, stairwells, gymnasium, and or cafeteria. It serves to assist those students who have been removed from their classrooms for various infractions. BIC is designed for students to improve their behavior by taking a time out to prevent them from being suspended. Did I mention I had to do this? I sure did. In 7th grade, I was a shithead. You know what? Never mind. This is not about me. It's not about my in-school suspension. Let's get back to Shanda's. Not only was Shanda going to be spending the next week of school isolated away from the general population of students, but she would also be spending that week in-school detention with none other than Amanda Heverin, the very same girl who had jumped her and who more or less was to blame for landing her in there in the first place. And I'm sure that neither girl was particularly jazzed about the idea of spending a week with the other, but over the course of this isolation, Amanda and Shanda actually came to realize that they didn't dislike each other. Quite the contrary, really. They actually happened to really enjoy one another. And this should have been great, right? You know, problem solved, hatchet buried, beef squashed. Well, maybe it could have been if it hadn't have been for Amanda's then girlfriend, 16-year-old Melinda Lovelace. Melinda was, shall we say, less than pleased when Amanda went from talking about how much she hated Shanda to how, you know, maybe she wasn't so bad. And then Melinda was even less pleased when She's Not So Bad started to morph into Amanda speaking frequently about how great Shanda was and how much she'd actually come to like her. Straight away, Melinda was angry and jealous and very territorial of Amanda. She started going out of her way to put herself into situations specifically to observe exactly how Shanda and Amanda interacted with one another. And this resulted in very much an ignorance is bliss kind of situation. Because if Melinda thought she hated hearing about Shanda and Amanda, seeing them enjoying each other's company in the flesh, well, that was a real kick in the nads. Melinda was so insecure and so threatened by this blossoming friendship that she wasted very little time in telling Amanda that she forbid her from spending time with Shanda. To which Amanda was like, you're not my real dad. You cannot tell me what to do. She decided that she most certainly was not going to stop speaking to and spending time with Shanda. So she just decided that from that point forward, she would do it in secret. behind Melinda's back. So, pausing from the bulk of the story for a second, let's get a little more context on Melinda, shall we? Who was she? What was her story? Well, wasn't great. Melinda was born in October of 1975, so at the time that our story takes place, she was 16 years old. She was the youngest daughter, born to her parents, Marjorie and Larry Lovelace. She had 2 older sisters, and all 3 of the girls, as well as their mother, were subjected to seemingly merciless sexual abuse at the hands of Larry. Not only did he force himself upon Marjorie on multiple occasions, but he also forced her to participate in sexual escapades with strangers that he would pick up in bars. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, Larry would routinely, verbally, as well as sexually abuse his daughters. This even allegedly went so far once that it's believed that Larry tied all 3 of the girls up in the family's garage to incapacitate them as he raped them one by one. And this abuse went on until just after Melinda's 15th birthday, when Marjorie caught Larry spying on Melinda and one of her friends. And this must just have been the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, because Marjorie then proceeded to attack Larry with a knife before she turned it on herself in an attempt to end her own life as well. Now, this was not the first time that Marjorie had attempted to end her life. However, it was, to my knowledge, the first time that she had ever physically attacked Larry. And a woman that stands up for her and her children was certainly not something that Larry was interested in. So following this incident, he promptly filed for divorce and he moved to Florida. And this absolutely crushed Melinda. She felt completely abandoned. And I understand that to those of us that were fortunate enough to not grow up like this might seem confusing, because this guy was clearly a fucking monster. So you would think that his absence would be a welcomed reprieve from the years of terror that he'd brought down upon his family. But kids' brains, especially kids who have been conditioned by trauma like this, they don't process things like you or I might. Instead, Melinda was confused. She felt that she and her father had had a close relationship, so when he seemingly abandoned her, she felt rejected and like she wasn't good enough. She actually tried desperately to maintain a relationship long distance with her father. They wrote letters back and forth for a little while, but eventually, after Larry remarried, the letters became fewer and farther between until one day they just stopped altogether. And Larry died in late 1998. And with his passing, he and Melinda obviously never got a chance to regain that contact or to resurrect their relationship. And while that's undoubtedly a blessing in disguise, because the man was just ugh, I have to imagine that given Melinda's very warped perception of her father and her misplaced loyalty to him, that she was likely deeply affected by her father's death. But of course, that's just my own speculation. As is my theory that this whole sense of abandonment and rejection that she felt following her father's exit directly influenced how severely she reacted to Amanda and Shanda's friendship. My guess is that feeling as though she could possibly be replaced by Shanda made her feel very similarly to how being abandoned and rejected by her father had made her feel. And in Melinda's defense, which this is the only time that those words will pass through the threshold of my lips. But she was right to worry, because there absolutely was something more than just a friendship brewing between Amanda and Shanda. That certainly does not mean that her irrational behavior going forward was even close to warranted. I'm just saying that she had a suspicion that Shanda and Amanda liked each other, and she wasn't wrong. There is nothing further to read into me saying in Melinda's defense. Honestly, I probably should have actually just said to Melinda's credit. Yeah, pretend I said that. To Melinda's credit, she had a hunch and she was right. The end. Anyways, Amanda and Shanda were very quickly escalating from a friendship to a romantic relationship. They were writing pretty sexually charged notes back and forth to one another. And they had started not only sneaking around behind Melinda's back to see one another, but they'd also started sneaking around behind Jackie's back. And eventually, one night when Shanda spent the night at Amanda's house, the girls took their relationship from just sexually charged notes to just straight up sex. Mind you, Amanda is 15 at this point, and Shanda is 12. So while it's not illegal per se, I don't think it's appropriate. I think that there is a big difference developmentally between a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old. So despite claims from Amanda that Shanda was the one to initiate the physical part of their relationship, I still think the fact that she engaged is a problem. Mind you, this whole time, Amanda and Melinda were still dating. And when she found out that Shanda and Amanda were still communicating, she physically threatened Shanda. She told Shanda to stay away from her girlfriend or else. And even though it's vague and nondescript, it is, in my opinion, still a threat nonetheless. And the bigger problem with this was that Amanda was the one that was constantly engaging with Shanda. She even had the audacity, the unmitigated gall, the absolute lack of forethought, and an unmatched level of I truly don't give a shit to invite Shanda to be her date to an upcoming school dance. Like, truly. How did she think this was going to play out? She knew damn good and well how possessive and controlling Melinda was. Melinda had allegedly slapped Amanda before just for looking at other girls, so there is no way that she could not have anticipated some form of massive blowback to come from taking Shanda to that dance. Personally, I think that she liked the way that this little competition between Melinda and Shanda made her feel, but that's just my 2 cents. Now, Melinda wasn't planning on attending this dance herself, but she did end up having a friend of hers drive her to the dance towards the end of it so that she could confront Shanda and Amanda. And this whole school dance debacle started to make Melinda realize that she was losing Amanda to Shanda. And ultimately, Amanda and Melinda finally did officially break up. And this catapulted Melinda into a deep depression. However, she did have a plan to turn things around. Melinda thought that maybe if she could turn the tables and make Amanda jealous, maybe she could win her back. So that is exactly what she tried to do. She started dating someone else. She made sure that Amanda found out about it, and lo and behold, this worked. Just as Melinda had to Shanda, Amanda started threatening Melinda's new girlfriend, and this led to she and Melinda reopening the lines of communication. And once they started talking again, they came to the conclusion that they did want to be together, and they decided that they were going to break it off with the other girls in order to do so. And I'm sorry, but this shit is just so messy. And at this particular point in the story, I place most of the blame on Amanda. She was the one that was toying with Melinda and Shanda's feelings. She was the one stoking the fire between the two of them. And she was the one who could not seem to make up her mind at the expense of Melinda and Shanda's feelings. It is just so aggravating knowing how the story proceeds that she deliberately created this massive drama between Melinda and Shanda that ends up ending in such a horrifyingly tragic way. But let me not get ahead of myself here. So, given how the story's gone so far, do you think that Amanda actually broke up with Shanda? Of course not. Why would she do that? Why would she do the right thing when she can keep seeing Shanda and just tell her that they need to keep their relationship a secret, because if Melinda found out about it, she'd probably kill Shanda. And all the while, she's still talking to Melinda, while she's also getting progressively more and more possessive and obsessive over Shanda. And I truly do not think that Shanda could have ever imagined just how out of control all of this was going to get. I mean, she was 12 years old. I feel like this all had to have just been so incredibly overwhelming for her. It's sad to think about. And all of this stress that Shanda was going through was certainly causing her to change in ways that were very obvious to those around her. She was losing interest in the things that her life once basically revolved around. She was withdrawing from her family, her grades were starting to suffer, she kept getting caught lying to her parents. Jackie was kind of getting to her wit's end. She just could not understand what was going on with her daughter, why on earth she was giving up everything she'd ever cared about, all for this Amanda person. This person who had beat her up the first time they'd ever met. And when confronted with these questions, Shanda broke down. She explained to her mother a decent amount of what had been going on over the preceding months. Most importantly, she finally told her mom who Melinda was, and specifically how scared she was of her, how she knew that Melinda wanted to hurt her. And after this moment of clarity, I guess you could call it, Shanda actually did start distancing herself from Amanda for a while. But eventually, Jackie found out that once again, Shanda was writing notes to Amanda, which prompted Jackie and Steve to have another sit-down conversation with Shanda about everything that was going on. And Shanda tried to tell them that there was nothing to worry about, but at this point, they had had enough. They just were not buying what Shanda was selling, and because of this, they immediately made the decision to take Shanda out of Hazelwood and to enroll her back into private school. Unfortunately, though, this did very little to deter the girls because Amanda and Shanda were still finding ways to not only communicate with one another, but also to see each other. And as Melinda came to the harsh realization that apparently no matter what she did, Shanda wasn't going anywhere. So Melinda put pen to paper so that she could let Amanda know just how very angry this made her. And she explicitly ended this letter by stating, "I want Shanda dead." And what is really upsetting is, had she just waited, she probably could have had Amanda back to herself after a while. Because after the initial, adjustment period, Shanda started to really enjoy her new school. She was making new friends. She had met a boy that she was interested in. If Melinda had just waited a couple more weeks. Shanda was in the process of ending her relationship with Amanda and moving on, despite Amanda's desperate attempts to keep her hooks in Shanda. But Melinda was at the end of her rope. She was done playing Amanda's games, and she was ready to finally take control of the situation and to take matters into her own hands. And that, my friends, brings us to the evening of January 10th, 1992. That evening, 3 girls piled into a car, headed to a rock concert. Hope Rippey, Lori Tackett, and Tony Lawrence had known each other for a while. Hope and Tony had been best friends since they were kids, and then Hope met Lori in middle school, and then eventually Hope introduced Tony to Lori sometime later. Then bing bang boom, now they're going to this concert. At least that was the story. However, allegedly, at least 2 of the girls in that car knew that that wasn't actually the plan that evening. Lori and Hope knew that they had other plans. Far more sinister plans. Plans to kill someone. But first, they had to stop and pick up the 4th and final member of their posse. And as I'm sure you already know, or you have likely guessed by this point, that 4th member was none other than Melinda Loveless. Because the person they were planning on killing that evening was 12-year-old Shanda Scherer. Now, Melinda and Lori had met each other a while back through some mutual friends that they had, but before this night, Hope and Tony had never so much as laid eyes on Melinda. So it is absolutely wild to me that Hope allegedly knew what the plan was for that evening, knew there was a chance that someone could get hurt, and she was still totally down to be involved. Why the actual fuck would you want to be involved in the physical harm and potentially the death of someone you don't know for someone you don't know? It is just something that I cannot wrap my head around, but apparently that was what was playing out. So yeah. Actually, you know what? Real quick, before we get too far into the events of that night, I'm going to take a break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, these horrible girls put their even more horrific plan into action. Don't go nowhere. All right, so when the three girls got to Melinda's house, that is supposedly when it became clear to Tony that things were going to be very different that evening than she had initially anticipated. Because while they were at Melinda's getting ready, that is when Melinda brandished a kitchen knife and explained to the girls that that was what she was going to use to scare Shanda. Now, supposedly, Tony didn't take this too seriously because up to this point, Melinda had seemed incredibly normal, especially in comparison to Lori, but I'll get more into these girls and their backgrounds in a little bit. But even though Tony would later say that she had no interest in being involved in anything like what Melinda was talking about, she still went with the other girls, even after seeing the knife and even after being explicitly told that at the very least it was going to be used to intimidate someone. Tony still chose to get back in the car and accompany them for whatever was going to unfold that evening. Once they left Melinda's house, the four girls drove to Shanda's dad's house, where Tony and Hope went to the door to try and lure Shanda to the car. They told her that they were friends with Amanda and that Amanda was off somewhere waiting for Shanda to hopefully come join her because she was desperate to talk to her about something. They said that Amanda had sent them and that they were there to pick up Shanda and to take her to Amanda. But Shanda was not able to leave her house right then. So instead, she told the girls to come back around midnight and that she would sneak out and go with them then. And woo, girl, when I tell you Melinda was pissed, when Hope and Tony got back to the car with the amended plan, Melinda was furious. She had an axe to grind, and she wanted to do it sooner rather than later. But as the girls drove away, Melinda chilled out slightly, and eventually the girls decided to just go ahead and actually go to the concert that they told their parents they were going to. They figured they'd go, they'd have a good time, and that by the time the concert was over, they'd be able to head back to Shanda's and resume Melinda's plan. And so that is exactly what they did. The concert ended, they piled back into the car, and they headed back to the Sharers. This time, Hope and Lori went to the door to get Shanda because Tony refused, and as they walked towards the house, Melinda positioned herself in the back seat underneath a blanket. The girls got Shanda into the car, they started driving away, and as they left the Sharer house behind them, Lori started asking Shanda questions about she and Amanda. And as Shanda answered Lori's questions, Melinda popped up from the back seat and ambushed Shanda, pressing the knife up to her throat. Shanda sobbed and she begged Melinda not to hurt her. But Melinda ignored her cries and instead continued to question Shanda about Amanda, explicitly asking her questions that she very likely did not want the answers to, but nevertheless, Shanda answered the questions honestly. Shanda was terrified. She cried the entire time that the girls drove her to their predetermined location, which was this ruined little stone building overlooking the Ohio River that is known as the Witch's Castle. And while the urban legends surrounding the castle being haunted by witches that had been murdered by townspeople probably aren't true, it doesn't change the fact that the rundown old stone building was incredibly creepy, especially at night to a little girl who had been forced there by three strangers and a jealous knife-wielding maniac. The four girls forced Shanda into the building where they tied her up and taunted her while they removed all of her jewelry. Lori then tried to, intimidate her further, I guess, as if that was really necessary at this point. I don't know. For some reason, she decided it was a good idea to light some random t-shirt on fire, but then after a couple of minutes, the girls started to worry that this might draw someone's attention to them, so they quickly forced Shanda back into the car and they fled the ruins. They then stopped at a gas station where Tony actually got out of the car and made a phone call while Lori was inside. She called a friend of hers, which, this could have been a perfect time to put a stop to all of this by calling the police, but instead, all she did was chat with her friend briefly to calm herself down. So talk about dropping the ball there. And then before they knew it, they were on the road again. They headed in the direction of Lori's while Melinda held a petrified and still sobbing Shanda at knife point in the backseat of the car. After driving about 50-ish miles, the girls pulled over into a secluded area less than a mile away from Lori's house, where Lori and Melinda forced Shanda back out of the car. Tony and Hope stayed in the car this time, watching as Melinda forced Shanda to remove her clothes before proceeding to physically attack her. Then, as Shanda begged for her life, Lori and Melinda took turns stabbing her. Lori then attempted to strangle Shanda with a rope that she'd brought with her, as Hope and Tony turned up the radio in Lori's car to drown out the sounds of Shanda's screams. Eventually, when Shanda lost consciousness and stopped screaming, Melinda and Lori just assumed that she was dead. They picked her up and put her in the trunk of the car before fleeing the scene and heading back to Lori's house. They snuck in as quietly as they could, leaving Shanda in the trunk while they attempted to clean themselves up. Now, remember, they're all under the impression that Shanda's dead at this point, so color them surprised when all of a sudden they noticed that if they listened hard enough, they could hear Shanda screaming from inside of the trunk, all the way inside Lori's house. So at this point, Lori decided to take it upon herself to finish Shanda off. So she went to her kitchen, she grabbed another knife, and went out to her trunk, proceeding to stab Shanda several more times. Then she went back inside and she told the other girls that they needed to take another little drive. But Hope and Tony were not interested, so they hung back together at Lori's house while Melinda and Lori headed out hoping to find a good place to dump Shanda's body. While they were driving around trying to, decide the best way to dispose of this innocent 12-year-old little girl that they believed they'd murdered, Lori and Melinda came to the conclusion that their best course of action would be for them to burn Shanda's body. And Lori just so happened to know the perfect spot. You see, there was a burn pit very close to Lori's house where her family often incinerated their trash. So she figured, why not do it there? Well, because there were neighbors. That's why. And those neighbors did see Lori's car pull up. And Lori saw those neighbors see her car pull up. And in the interest of not being completely stupid, she decided that it probably wasn't a great idea to try and incinerate a body in front of witnesses. So instead, they decided to drive around a little bit longer before it dawned on them that, they didn't even really know for sure if Shanda was actually dead. And much to their surprise, when they opened up the trunk, Shanda sat up. She sat up and she cried out desperately for her mother as Lori savagely bludgeoned her with a tire iron. After this, they would stop for Lori to repeat this process multiple times over the next few hours. And this shit is just so awful. And to make it exponentially worse, which probably seems hard to believe, but there's actually evidence that Shanda was sodomized with that tire iron as well at some point throughout the evening. Although Melinda and Lori both refused to take responsibility for that. I guess they thought that was too far to admit to people. Now, I'm inclined to believe that Lori was the one responsible for that because she just seemed to be really, really into the whole, tire iron element. She apparently relished in the fact that she could feel Shanda's skull break under the force that she'd hit her with. And what's truly horrifying about all of this was, even after all of these attacks with the tire iron, Shanda had been beaten, stabbed, strangled, stabbed again, bludgeoned again, and sodomized. And even so, she was still alive in that trunk. Lori and Melinda returned to the Tackett house around dawn on Saturday, January 11th. They brought Hope and Tony out to the car specifically so that they could brag to them about what they had done and about what terrible shape Shanda was in. And hearing this, Hope, Miss, I don't want anything to do with this anymore. Yeah, she grabbed a bottle of cleaning fluid and she started spraying it on Shanda while she chanted things like, "Oh yeah, you're not so hot now, are you?" Seriously, what the fuck is wrong with these girls? That's a rhetorical question. Like I said, I'll get into what was actually wrong with them towards the end. It is just unbelievable to me that humans can do these things to one another, let alone teenage girls. Like, it's just hard to even fathom. Anyways, after discussing their next move, the 4 girls got back in the car and they made their way to a nearby gas station. They purchased a 2-liter bottle of soda from inside, which they immediately poured out and proceeded to fill with gasoline. And then they got back in the car and they made their way to Lemon Road, which is a fairly desolate area surrounded by nothing but soybean fields. Once they'd parked, Hope, Lori, and Melinda wrapped Shanda in a blanket and they pulled her out of the trunk. Lori then shoved the bottle of gasoline into Hope's hands, telling her to pour it on Shanda, which ultimately Hope did. She poured about half of the bottle's worth onto her as Lori lit a match and dropped it onto Shanda. Instantly, her body ignited as the girls piled back into the car, ready to flee yet another scene. However, as they drove away, they realized that the fire, it didn't look very strong, I guess. It looked like it could fairly easily go out. So Melinda got out and chucked the rest of the bottle of gasoline onto Shanda. And as the fire picked back up, Melinda hopped back into the car, cackling and mocking the way that Shanda looked as she was dying. Yes, Shanda was still alive when they lit her on fire. And Melinda hopped back in the car, smiling and laughing, telling the other girls how happy she was that Shanda was finally gone. And then these 4 girls went to McDonald's to get some breakfast. Yeah, just researching this case, I felt like I couldn't eat. But these girls were able to torture a little girl, burn her body, and then just head off to McD's for breakfast like it was nothing. And then, what's even more abhorrent and disgusting is that while sitting there eating their fucking McMuffins or whatever the fuck, Lori pulled the sausage off of her sandwich and made a joke about how it looked like Shanda's body. When I read that, I was seriously fucking speechless. How callous and detached from humanity can one person possibly be? It is absolutely just fucking mind-boggling. Once the girls were done with their breakfast, they finally mostly went their separate ways. But before they did separate for the day, they made sure to make a pact to never tell anyone what had happened or what they had done. And it wasn't until this point of the story that I actually realized they believed they were going to get away with this. I truly do not know how they could have possibly been so naive to think that they were actually going to get away with this sloppy ass mess of a crime. But the fact that they made a promise to each other not to tell and not to talk about it makes me believe that they genuinely thought that they would. But just as they were all getting back home and hoping to get back to their lives and pretend that nothing had happened, 2 brothers were about to make a horrifying discovery. The Foley brothers were heading out for the day to go hunting when, while driving down Lemon Road, they stumbled upon what they believed to be a burned up, discarded mannequin, which let's all just collectively take a minute to understand and comprehend that it's never a mannequin, okay? But they initially thought that it was. That is, until they got a closer look. The Foley brothers called 911 to report what they'd found just before 11 a.m. on January 11th, 1992. And meanwhile, back at the Sharers, Shanda's dad was beside himself, trying to figure out where on earth Shanda could have gone. He and Jackie spent all morning calling around to every single one of Shanda's friends, hoping that they would track her down, but no one had seen her. They were quickly realizing just how serious this situation truly might be. So they finally decided to make the call to Clark County Police Department to formally report Shanda missing. And while this was going on, while Shanda's parents were desperately trying to find their daughter, cracks were starting to form in the sisterhood of the traveling psychos. Melinda and Lori spent the day with another one of Melinda's friends, telling her all of the horrifying details from the night before. And then the 3 of them tracked Amanda down and told her everything as well. As for Tony and Hope, they'd reconvened that afternoon and gone to a bowling alley where they decided to blab about what had happened to some of their classmates pretty much right when they got there. You know how bowling is. Step 1, grab your bowling shoes. Step 2, confess to murder. Luckily, these kids, the ones that Hope and Tony told about what had happened, they actually had some goddamn sense in their heads, and they told them, like, yo, you guys should call the fucking police, bro. Which Hope and Tony said that they would, but they actually ended up going to their parents first. And what's wild is that Tony's parents were adamant that they needed to go to the police, which I feel like is a normal reaction. But Hope's parents were like, you know what? Let's just lay low and see what happens. Honestly, though, I don't really think it would have mattered, because with as many people as these girls were telling, someone was bound to go to the police at some point. But nevertheless, Tony's parents took her to the police station, where she gave a statement, and she gave the police the first glimpse into everything that had happened to Shanda leading up to her death. Kinda. During her initial statement, she tried real hard to minimize she and Hope's involvement and to push all of the blame onto Melinda and Lori. And after hearing all of the gruesome details Tony was able to provide, an officer went straight to Melinda's house to keep an eye on she and Lori until a proper arrest warrant had been issued. They finally got the go-ahead to actually arrest the girls in the wee hours of the morning on January 12th. Lori didn't really seem fazed by their arrest. However, Melinda was very upset. But to clarify, I think she was only upset because she'd been caught, not because at that moment she had remorse or regret for anything that she'd done. The prosecution was immediately set on charging all 4 of them as adults, given the heinous nature of what they'd done. Initially, Hope and Tony were charged with murder, arson, battery, criminal confinement, and intimidation. That said, Tony was then offered a plea deal in which she would plead guilty to criminal confinement resulting in serious bodily injury, and all of her other charges would be dropped, with the caveat that she would testify against the other 3 girls if necessary, which she did agree to do. She accepted the plea bargain in April of 1992, and this specific charge held a maximum sentence of 20 years. The other 3 girls were also offered multiple plea deals, all of which they and their lawyers turned down at first because they didn't think that they were good enough. And their refusal to accept these deals and to spare their little town this incredibly expensive spectacle of a trial, well, this made the pendulum swing real far in the opposite direction. Yeah, hoping to, for lack of a better term, force the girl's hand, taking a plea deal, the head prosecutor made it known to Melinda and Lori that if they forced their cases to go to trial, that because they were being tried as adults, he would be seeking the death penalty. And even though it was highly unlikely that a judge would ever actually sentence them to death, both girls did ultimately decide that, you know what, they'd rather not take their chances. They both accepted plea deals in September of 1992, pleading guilty to murder, arson, and criminal confinement resulting in serious bodily injury. And while Hope was never eligible for the death penalty, she still ended up taking a plea deal, pleading guilty to the same charges as Melinda and Lori. So murder, arson, and criminal confinement. And with that, one by one, I am now going to go through and tell you a little bit about each of these girls and the so-called mitigating factors that were considered when crafting their sentences, starting with Tony. Now, as far as I could find, Tony had a fairly normal childhood up until she was about 9 years old, at which point she was abused by a relative of hers. Then at 14, she was raped by a classmate who, in turn, was given a tickle on the wrist as... honestly, I can't even say as a punishment, because the police, for real, were just like, yeah, don't do that again. Which honestly should not surprise me for the time period that we're in, but it is still obnoxious. And then on top of the fact that this little shithead saw absolutely no repercussions for his actions, a lot of Tony's classmates actually seemed to turn on her following her reporting this incident to the police. And she struggled a lot with this, feeling as if she'd been cast out for something that wasn't even her fault. And this resulted in her engaging in promiscuity, self-harm, and she even attempted to take her own life at one point. And all of these things were considered when she was given her sentence of 20 years max. She ended up serving 9 years before she was released on parole in December of 2000. And she remained on parole for the following 2 years before she was officially a free woman at the age of 26. Next on the docket, Hope Rippey. Hope came from, I guess you could say, an interesting family dynamic. Her parents divorced when she was 7, and her mother moved away, taking Hope and some of her siblings, and leaving Hope's father and some of her other siblings behind. So the family was like completely split in half for about 3 years until her parents decided that they wanted to try and give their relationship another try. Unfortunately, though, their relationship was still tumultuous, which bled over into the children's relationships with one another. Basically, it seems like these kids were conditioned from a very young age to solve all of their problems with anger and violence. And when Hope hit high school, she began to rebel, as most of us do. She started smoking, having sex, and engaging in self-harm. Hope was initially sentenced to 60 years for her part in Shanda's death. However, after taking these experiences into consideration, 10 years of that sentence was suspended. And then later on an appeal, a judge opted to reduce her sentence even further to just 35 years. She went on to serve less than half of that sentence, and she was released in 2006. So she served 14 years in prison, and then she was released on supervised parole for another 5 years, which made her officially a free woman at the age of 34. And then, that brings us to Miss Lori Tackett. Lori was raised by her violently religious mother and her twice convicted felon father. Her home life was so strictly and so devoutly religious that allegedly her mother strangled her once when she found out that Lori was changing out of her ankle-length dresses and into jeans at school. And this event began a long relationship between CPS and the Tacketts. Yeah, after all this went down, Lori's parents were basically told, hey, we're gonna be popping in every now and then, for a while to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Okay? But even so, Lori claims that she was molested twice throughout her childhood. I'm not sure of the specifics of these alleged incidents, but she claims that it took place at least once when she was 5 and at least once when she was 12. So take that information for what you will. When Lori turned 15, she started to rebel, but not necessarily in the average rebellious teenager way. No, Lori became fascinated with the occult. She began pretending to be possessed by a vampire. She started self-harming, and she even began drinking blood on occasion. Lori once accidentally cut her wrist so deeply that she actually ended up having to be hospitalized. And once she had been treated for her physical wounds, she moved to the psychiatric ward of the hospital to be assessed for whatever was clearly going on with her up north. She was ultimately diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which she never really got any consistent help or treatment for. She dropped out of high school in late 1991, and, well, we all know what she went on to become from there. So, armed with that knowledge, the prosecution offered Lori a plea bargain of 60 years for the aforementioned crimes. She ended up serving 26 years of that sentence before she was released on parole. She completed 1 year of parole before she was officially a free woman at the age of 44. And that brings us to Melinda, the so-called ringleader of the attack on Shanda, and the one member of the foursome deemed to have the most extensive history of abuse and mental trauma, which obviously we know all about given the fairly extensive background I provided on Melinda at the beginning of the video. So knowing all of the same things that we know about Melinda and her upbringing and the abuse she suffered at the hands of her father, the prosecution offered her the same 60-year plea bargain that was offered to Lori. She served 27 years of that sentence before she was released on parole at 44. So, what do you think? Given all those mitigating factors and given what you know happened to Shanda and given what part you know each girl played, do you think that their sentences were adequate? Do you think that they each served a just amount of time? I am really curious as to what you guys think about how all of this played out, because I feel like I have two different opinions. Let me explain. As a mother, and speaking from the empathy that I feel for Jackie, it is really easy for me to say that Melinda and Lori should have served a lot more time. I feel like for what they did, getting out in their 40s gave them way too much normal life to live once they were released. And granted, I know that once you're a convicted felon, you never really live a normal life. But given what they did to Shanda and the amount of life that they took from her and the heinous way they did it, I don't know. Being free in their mid-40s just seems too good for them. Not to mention that I feel like Lori in particular was just a dangerous person in general. And I think that her being released in her 40s still gives her a lot of time to potentially commit other crimes. Because remember, she didn't have a personal or a vested interest in bringing harm to Shanda. She simply wanted to know what it would be like to hurt someone. So again, out of all of them, I feel like she's the one I'd be the least surprised to hear that she'd reoffended. But then from an objective standpoint, not speaking as a mother, I don't know, man, I still think that most of those sentences were pretty light. I think Tony's was fine, I guess. I definitely think that Hope should have served a little more time than she did. And I don't know, I really think that Melinda and Lori should not have been let out until they were at least in their mid-50s, if not in their early 60s. At the end of the day, what they did was absolutely horrific. And the fact that they were capable of doing something so depraved and so disgusting at such a young age, I don't know, it is scary. To think that at any point they could have stopped and been like, hey, what the fuck are we doing? But they didn't. Tony made that phone call at the gas station when she could have just as easily called the police, but she didn't. Hope and Tony had every opportunity to leave and distance themselves from the plan at one point when they were alone in Lori's car at that concert, but they didn't. No, it wasn't until it was beyond too late that any of them decided to speak up. And because of that, a family lost an amazing, sweet, loving, beautiful little girl. On an episode of Dr. Phil, Jackie, when asked to describe Shanda, described her as a happy, fun-loving, typical little girl with a tender heart. She said that just the thought of upsetting someone could bring tears to Shanda's eyes. And as hard as I'm sure it was for Jackie to do, she has actually contributed to the rehabilitation efforts of Melinda, because that's what she believes Shanda would have wanted her to do. While Melinda was in prison, she became a dog trainer for Indiana's Canine Assistance Network program, or ICAN program, which is a program that allows inmates to train service dogs for the disabled. And Melinda became a really widely respected and really widely trusted trainer in the program. And after much thought, this prompted Jackie to actually donate a dog named Angel to the program specifically for Melinda to train. It was her hope that in doing so, Melinda would be able to do some good in Shanda's name. And I have to say that that is incredibly big of Jackie to do, because, man, I don't know if I'm just like a vengeful, spiteful bitch or what, but I cannot see me doing something like that if I was in Jackie's shoes. I don't think I'm that selfless. But anyways, guys, that about wraps us up for today. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below, especially what you thought of the sentences and the time that these girls actually ended up serving. Thank you so much again to Jen for requesting this one. I think it is an incredibly important case that opens up a discussion around a lot of really significant topics. If you have a case or a topic that you would like to see me cover, please fill out the request submission form that I have linked in the description box. And if you have any interest in the products I used throughout today's story, you will find links to all of that stuff down there as well. If you haven't already, which I know that some of you have not, please consider subscribing to the channel. I put out new videos every week, and if you turn on your post notifications, I will definitely catch you back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys. Girl, what? God. I can't. She thought was cute? What? Straight away. Ish. Whoa. Not even close.